The sound of hammering metal had been silent in Salvation Creek, Colorado for 3 weeks when Jacob Moss descended from his solitary cabin in the high country, and the absence of that rhythmic clanging struck him harder than he expected as he guided his pack mule down the rocky trail into town on that crisp September morning in 1878. Jacob was a man built by the mountains themselves, all broad shoulders and thick arms corded with muscle from splitting timber and hauling stone, his dark hair hanging past his collar and his beard neatly trimmed despite his isolated existence. At 29 years old, he had spent the last 7 years living alone in the peaks, trapping furs and hunting game, coming down only when supplies ran low or winter threatened to seal the passes completely. He preferred the company of pine trees and elk to most people, finding peace in the silence that others found unsettling. But even a solitary man noticed when something fundamental changed in the small community that served as his lifeline to civilization. The town stretched along a shallow creek bed, false-fronted buildings lining a dusty main street that turned to thick mud whenever rain fell from the towering clouds that gathered over the Continental Divide. Jacob tied his mule outside Gunderson's Mercantile and stepped onto the weathered boardwalk, his boots making hollow sounds against the planks. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Gunderson arranging canned goods on a shelf, her movements precise and unhurried. The store smelled of coffee and tobacco and lye soap when he pushed through the door, the little bell announcing his arrival. "Mr. Moss," Mrs. Gunderson said, turning with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Haven't seen you since June." "Been a quiet summer," Jacob replied, removing his wide-brimmed hat. "Need to stock up before the snow flies." "Of course." She moved behind the counter, pulling out her ledger. "The usual?" "Yes, madam. Coffee, flour, salt, ammunition if you have my caliber." As she began assembling his order, Jacob's gaze drifted to the notice board near the door. Among the wanted posters and advertisements for patent medicines, a single sheet stood out, its edges already beginning to curl. "Estate sale," it read in careful script. "All tools and equipment belonging to the late Samuel Hartwell, blacksmith. Inquire with Mrs. Margaret Hartwell, house behind the old forge." Jacob stared at those words, feeling something shift in his chest. Samuel Hartwell. He had been a good man, solid and reliable, the kind who could fix anything made of metal and never charged more than fair price. Jacob had brought him a broken bear trap once, its spring mechanism shattered, and Samuel had it working again within an hour, refusing payment beyond a haunch of venison. "Shame about Samuel," Mrs. Gunderson said quietly, noticing where Jacob's attention had settled. "Heart just gave out, they say. One moment he was working at the forge, the next he was gone. Left poor Margaret with nothing but debts and a house full of equipment she cannot use." "How is she managing?" Jacob asked, surprised by his own question. He barely knew Margaret Hartwell, had seen her perhaps a dozen times over the years, a plump woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron from the pies she baked for church socials. Mrs. Gunderson shook her head. "Not well. The banker is circling like a vulture. Samuel owed money on the property, on the tools, on everything. Margaret has been trying to sell what she can, but most folks around here cannot afford to buy a whole blacksmith's operation. They need horseshoes, not anvils." She paused, lowering her voice. "I heard she might have to move in with her sister in Denver. Would break her heart to leave. This has been her home for 15 years. Jacob said nothing, but the information settled into him like a stone, dropping into deep water. He paid for his supplies, loaded them onto his mule, and stood in the street as the afternoon sun slanted across the mountains. He should head back. He had everything he needed. Winter preparation could not wait for sentiment or the problems of people he barely knew. Instead, he found himself walking toward the eastern edge of town, where the blacksmith's forge stood silent, its chimney cold. The house behind it was small but well-maintained, white paint only beginning to peel, a garden plot out front where the last of the summer vegetables were struggling in the cooling nights. Jacob stood at the gate for a long moment, arguing with himself, before finally pushing it open and approaching the front door. His knock was firm but not aggressive. For several seconds nothing happened, and he almost turned away. Then the door opened, and Margaret Hartwell stood before him, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with soft curves that spoke of good cooking and comfortable living rather than hardship. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, wisps escaping around a face that showed the strain of recent weeks. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as if she had cried all the tears she had and now faced the world with exhausted resignation. She wore a simple gray dress that marked her as still in mourning, and her hands were work-roughened despite her husband's trade having provided well enough. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jacob said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I am Jacob Moss. I live up in the high country. I saw your notice about the tools." Her expression shifted, hope and wariness mixing together. "Mr. Moss." "Yes. Please come in." The house was clean and spare, furnished with pieces that Samuel had clearly made himself, the metalwork elegant and precise. The smell of baking bread filled the air, and Jacob saw a small table set for one, a half-eaten meal growing cold. Margaret gestured him toward a chair in the modest sitting room, then perched on the edge of another, her posture rigid with tension. "You're interested in the tools?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Jacob had not planned what to say. He was not a blacksmith, had no use for anvils and hammers and tongs, but he found himself nodding. "I would like to know what you are selling and what you are asking." Relief flooded her features, so profound that it made her seem younger, more vulnerable. "Everything. The forge, the anvils, the hammers, the tongs, the stock iron and steel, the coal, the bellows, all of it." Samuel had the best equipment in 3 counties. He took such pride in his work. Her voice caught on the last word, and she looked away, blinking rapidly. Jacob sat quietly, letting her gather herself. When she continued, her tone was steadier, but strained. "The banker says I owe $800 on everything combined. The property, the tools, the house. If I cannot pay by the end of October, he will foreclose and sell it all at auction." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I've been trying to find a buyer for weeks, but no one has that kind of money, and even if they did, they would rather wait for the auction and get it cheaper, $800. It was a substantial sum, but not impossible. Jacob had 7 years of firm money saved, kept in a strongbox in his cabin because he had nothing to spend it on and no one to spend it for. He lived off the land, needed little, wanted less. The money just accumulated, meaningless except as an abstract measure of his solitude. "Why not sell it piece by piece?" he asked. "I tried. But the forge is built into the structure. The anvils weigh hundreds of pounds each. The tools are worth more as a complete set to someone who knows the trade. And I do not have time to wait for individual buyers. The banker has been very clear about his timeline." Her jaw tightened. Very clear. Something dark flickered in Jacob's chest at the way she said that. "Has he been inappropriate with you?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly at his bluntness, but she did not look away. "He has suggested that there might be other arrangements we could make. I have declined. I would rather lose everything than compromise myself that way." Jacob's hands curled into fists on his knees, knuckles whitening. He had little use for most people, but he had even less use for men who preyed on widows in their vulnerability. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to focus. "If I bought everything, the complete set, for $800, would that clear all the debts?" Margaret stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. Yes, it would. But Mr. Moss, are you a blacksmith? I do not mean to question your interest, but this is specialized equipment. It would be a waste if you could not use it properly." "I am not a blacksmith," Jacob admitted, "but I can learn. And even if I could not, the tools would be yours to continue using." "I do not understand." Jacob did not entirely understand either. He was operating on instinct, on a feeling that had no rational explanation. "I would buy the equipment to clear your debts, the forge, the house, all of it. But you would stay here, keep living as you have been. The property would be secure, the banker would have no claim, and you would not have to leave your home." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks now, and she made no move to stop them. "Why would you do that? You do not know me. We have spoken perhaps twice in all the years you have been coming to Salvation Creek. Your husband fixed my bear trap once, refused to take more than meat for payment, said a man who fed himself honestly was doing right by the world." Jacob met her eyes steadily. "Seems to me a woman who would rather lose everything than sell herself deserves the same consideration. Honesty should be honored." Margaret pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. Jacob sat awkwardly, unused to emotional displays, unsure whether he should leave or stay. After a moment, she lowered her hands and looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "That is the kindest thing anyone has ever offered me," she whispered, "but I cannot accept charity. It would not be right." "Then do not think of it as charity. Think of it as a business arrangement. I buy the property and equipment, you maintain it, keep it in good condition, and teach me the blacksmith's trade when I come down from the mountains. A fair exchange. You want to learn blacksmithing?" "A man alone needs to know how to fix things," Jacob said, which was true enough, even if it was not his primary motivation. "And there is no blacksmith in Salvation Creek now. The town will need one. If you know the trade, you could continue your husband's work." "I know some of it," Margaret said slowly. "Samuel taught me the basics. I can do simple repairs, make horseshoes, basic hardware. I am not skilled enough for the fine work he did, but I could manage the everyday needs." She paused, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "You're serious about this? You would spend $800 to help someone you barely know?" "I am serious." "Why?" Jacob had no good answer to that, or at least none that he could articulate. He only knew that the thought of this woman being forced from her home by debt and circumstances beyond her control struck him as fundamentally wrong, a violation of something he could not name but felt deeply. He also knew that he had spent 7 years alone on a mountain, and while he told himself he preferred it that way, there were nights when the silence felt less like peace and more like punishment. "Does there need to be a reason beyond it being the right thing to do?" he finally said. Suddenly, Margaret studied him for a long moment, then slowly shook her head. "I suppose not." She drew a shaky breath. "If you are truly willing, Mr. Moss, then I accept. God knows I have prayed for a miracle, and perhaps you are the answer I did not expect." They worked out the details over the next hour. Jacob would return in 3 days with the money. Margaret would have all the paperwork prepared, the debts itemized, everything ready for legal transfer. It was all very practical and businesslike, but beneath the surface, Jacob felt something shifting, some fundamental change in the trajectory of his life that both excited and terrified him. When he finally left, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret stood in her doorway, watching him go, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. He did not look back, but he thought about her the entire ride up the mountain, and that night in his cabin, he stared at the strongbox that held his accumulated years of isolation and wondered what he had just set in motion. 3 days later, Jacob returned to Salvation Creek with $800 in a leather pouch, his hands sweating despite the cool autumn air. He met Margaret at the land office, where a sour-faced clerk processed the paperwork with obvious disapproval. The banker appeared halfway through, a portly man with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said smoothly, "I was not aware you had found a buyer. We could have arranged something far more favorable through proper channels." "Mr. Moss made a fair offer," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "I saw no reason to delay." The banker's gaze shifted to Jacob, assessing and dismissive in equal measure. "You are the hermit from the high country? Interesting. I hope you know what you are getting into. Blacksmithing is a demanding trade, not suited for amateurs." "I will manage," Jacob said flatly, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. The banker lingered a moment longer, then left with a final poisonous look at Margaret. When the paperwork was complete and the money transferred, Jacob found himself the legal owner of a blacksmith's forge, a house, and a 1/4 acre of land in Salvation Creek, Colorado. It felt surreal, like someone else's life he had accidentally stepped into. Outside the land office, Margaret turned to him, her expression complex. "The house is yours now, Mr. Moss. I will gather my things and find somewhere else to stay while I look for work." "That was not our agreement," Jacob said immediately. "You stay in the house. I have my cabin. This was about keeping you in your home, not turning you out of it." "But it is not proper for me to live in a house owned by an unmarried man who is not family," Margaret protested. "People will talk. Let them talk. Anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with me directly." Margaret bit her lip, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. "At least let me pay you rent. I can work the forge, take commissions, and give you a portion of the earnings. That way, it is a legitimate business arrangement, not charity." Jacob considered this. It would give her pride, purpose, a way to maintain her dignity. Fair enough. You work the forge, keep the house maintained, and give me 10% of earnings. The rest is yours to live on. 10%? That's far too little. It should be at least half. It is my forge, my terms. 10% or nothing. They argued about it for another 5 minutes before Margaret finally, reluctantly agreed. As they walked back toward the forge together, Jacob felt the stares of townsfolk, the whispers that followed in their wake. He ignored them, but he saw the way Margaret's shoulders tensed, the way she held her head a fraction too high, defiant against the judgment. At the house, she invited him in for coffee, and he accepted, curious about this new strange territory he had entered. She moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and soon they were sitting across from each other at the small table. The silence between them not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. "Nay, I should teach you the basics," Margaret said finally. "If you are going to own a forge, you should know how it works." "I would appreciate that." She led him out to the workshop behind the house, a sturdy building with a high roof and a central forge built from fire brick and stone. The anvils stood like iron monuments, the larger one easily 300 pounds of solid steel. Tools hung on the walls in precise order, each one clean and well-maintained despite weeks of disuse. Jacob could feel Samuel Hartwell's presence in this place, the ghost of a good man's life work. Margaret moved to the forge, explaining the bellows, the coal, the different types of metal and their properties. She spoke with growing confidence, and Jacob realized she knew far more than she had initially admitted. Samuel had clearly trained her well, perhaps hoping she would be his partner in the trade rather than just his wife. "Show me something," Jacob said. "Make something simple." Margaret hesitated, then selected a piece of scrap iron and began building up the fire. Jacob watched as she worked the bellows, heating the metal until it glowed orange, then red, then white-hot. She pulled it out with tongs and set it on the anvil, and the first strike of her hammer rang out like a bell, echoing across the quiet town. Jacob felt something catch in his chest at that sound, the same sound that had been missing for 3 weeks. Margaret worked the metal with competent strokes, not as strong or fast as a man might be, but precise and controlled. Within minutes, she had shaped the scrap into a simple hook, the kind used for hanging tools or kitchen implements. She quenched it in the water barrel, steam hissing up around her hands, and held it up for his inspection. "It is basic work," she said, almost apologetically. "Samuel could make art. I can make useful things." "Useful is good," Jacob said, taking the hook and examining it. The metalwork was clean, the hook properly curved and strong. "The town needs useful things. Do you want to try?" Jacob did. She talked him through the process, correcting his grip on the hammer, showing him how to read the color of the metal, when to strike and when to let it heat longer. His first attempts were clumsy, the metal bending unevenly under his unpracticed blows. But he was strong, and he learned quickly, and by the time the sun was setting, he had managed to produce a crude nail, bent and irregular but recognizable. "You have the strength for it," Margaret said, smiling for the first time since he had met her. "With practice, you could be good at this." They stood together in the dimming light, both of them smudged with soot and sweat, and Jacob felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as contentment, a sense of purpose he had not experienced since leaving his family's farm in Missouri a decade ago. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Jacob would come down from the mountains every few days, bringing meat and furs to trade, and Margaret would give him lessons at the forge. Word spread that the blacksmith shop was operational again, and people began bringing work. Horses that needed shoeing, wagon wheels that needed reinforcement, tools that needed repair. Margaret handled most of it with quiet competence, and Jacob watched and learned, his hands growing calloused in new ways. Between the hammer strokes and the heat of the forge, they talked. Carefully at first, observing the proprieties, but gradually with more openness. Margaret told him about her life, growing up in St. Louis, meeting Samuel when he was traveling through selling his wares, falling in love with his gentle strength and his craftsman's hands. She told him about the early years of their marriage, building the business together, the happiness they had found in this small mountain town. "We wanted children," she said one afternoon, her voice soft with old grief. "But it never happened. Samuel said perhaps God had other plans for us. He was good about accepting things he could not change. Jacob, in turn, shared fragments of his own history. The family farm, the too many brothers competing for too little land, his decision to head west and make his own way. The years of trapping and hunting, the harsh winters and dangerous encounters with bears and mountain lions. The solitude that had felt like freedom at first, but had gradually calcified into something harder and colder. "Do you get lonely up there?" Margaret asked, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Sometimes," Jacob admitted, "but people are complicated. Animals and mountains are straightforward. People can be straightforward too if you find the right ones." He looked at her, this soft, curved woman with soot on her cheek and strength in her eyes, and felt something shift inside him, like ice beginning to crack under spring sun. October arrived with cold winds and the first dusting of snow on the highest peaks. Jacob knew he should be preparing his cabin for winter, stockpiling firewood and meat, battening down for the months of isolation ahead. Instead, he found himself in Salvation Creek more often than not, working at the forge, taking on more of the heavier tasks as his skills improved. The town had accepted Margaret's continued presence in the house, partly because the arrangement clearly benefited everyone. The blacksmith shop was operational again, providing essential services. Margaret was respectable and proper, never giving cause for scandal. And Jacob, while strange and solitary, was known to be honest and hard-working. The gossips found no purchase and eventually moved on to other topics. But Jacob himself could not move on. He found himself thinking about Margaret at odd hours, remembering the way she laughed when he made a particularly crooked horseshoe, or the concentration on her face when she worked on a delicate repair. He noticed details he had no business noticing, the way her hair curled at her temples when she worked near the heat, the softness of her hands despite the hard work, the curve of her smile when she was genuinely pleased. He told himself it was inappropriate. She was a widow, still in mourning. He was a man who had no business courting anyone, certainly not a woman who deserved stability and community, not a hermit who disappeared into the mountains for months at a time. But the feelings persisted, growing stronger with each shared day, each conversation, each moment when their hands accidentally touched and both pulled away too quickly. Margaret, for her part, seemed to exist in a state of careful neutrality, friendly but not forward, grateful but not effusive. Jacob could not read her feelings, and he did not trust himself to ask. So he worked beside her, taught himself patience, and tried to ignore the growing certainty that he was falling in love with a woman he had no right to want. The first real snow came in mid-October, a wet, heavy storm that blanketed the town overnight. Jacob woke in the small room he had started renting above the general store, not wanting to make the dangerous trip up the mountain in deteriorating weather, and looked out at a world transformed to white. The mountains were invisible behind veils of falling snow, and the streets of Salvation Creek were empty and silent. He made his way to the forge, breaking trail through knee-deep drifts. The shop was dark and cold, but smoke rose from the house's chimney. He knocked, stamping snow from his boots, and Margaret opened the door wrapped in a thick shawl, her face pink from the warmth inside. "Mr. Moss," she said, surprise clear in her voice. "I did not expect anyone to venture out in this weather." "Wanted to make sure you were all right," Jacob said, suddenly feeling foolish. Of course she was all right. She had survived 15 Colorado winters. But Margaret smiled, and it was warm enough to melt the snow on his shoulders. "Come in. I have coffee and breakfast. You must be frozen." The house was cozy, the stove radiating heat, the smell of frying bacon filling the air. Jacob shed his coat and hat, settling at the table while Margaret moved around the kitchen. She served him eggs and bacon, biscuits with butter and jam, coffee so strong and hot it burned going down. They ate together in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall past the window. "It will be a hard winter," Margaret said finally. "The almanac predicted it, and the animals have been preparing early. I saw the squirrels gathering nuts in September, and the bears went to their dens earlier than usual." "You will have enough supplies?" Jacob asked. "Yes. I've been careful with money, and the forge has brought in steady work. I will be fine." She paused. "What about you? Will you go back to your cabin?" "Eventually, but I may wait until the weather breaks." "You could stay in the spare room here," Margaret said, then immediately flushed. "I mean, if you need a place, it would be more comfortable than the room above the mercantile, and you could help with the heavier forge work during the winter. People still need horseshoes and repairs, even in the snow." Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. Living under the same roof, even in separate rooms, would cross a line they had carefully maintained. But the offer was practical, sensible even. The spare room was sitting empty. He was paying rent elsewhere when space was available here, and the forge work would benefit from his presence. "If you are sure it would not be improper," he said carefully. "We are business partners," Margaret replied, her voice steady even as color remained high on her cheeks. "And the arrangement is already unusual enough that a room rental will hardly matter. Besides, Mrs. Gunderson rents you a room, and no one questions her propriety. Mrs. Gunderson is 60 years old. And I am a grown woman capable of managing my own household and reputation." Margaret's chin lifted slightly, defiant. "I am offering a room for rent to my business partner during the winter months. If people choose to make it into something scandalous, that is their failing, not mine." Jacob felt a surge of admiration for her quiet strength. "Then I accept. Thank you." They settled the details over the rest of breakfast. Jacob would pay the same rate he paid the mercantile, would take his meals separately to maintain propriety, would help with heavy chores and forge work in exchange for the convenience. It was all very businesslike and proper, and it did nothing to slow the racing of Jacob's heart. He moved his few belongings that afternoon, carrying everything he owned in a single pack. The spare room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out on the mountains. Margaret had clearly prepared it for him: fresh linens on the bed, a water pitcher, and basin on the dresser. It felt strange to have a room in a house again, to be part of a household rather than isolated in his cabin. That night, he lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving around nearby. The creak of floorboards, the soft clink of dishes being washed, the rustle of Margaret preparing for bed in her own room down the short hallway. It was intimate in a way that made his chest ache, a reminder of how much he had given up in choosing solitude and how much he suddenly wanted back. The weeks that followed established new rhythms. Jacob woke early, started the fire in the main stove, and had coffee brewing by the time Margaret emerged from her room. They took breakfast together because it made no sense to cook separately, then moved to the forge where they worked side by side through the short winter days. Jacob's skills improved rapidly under her patient instruction, his natural strength combining with growing technique to produce increasingly competent work. Customers came and went, many of them surprised to find the hermit from the high country working at the forge, but most accepting it as one more oddity in a town full of peculiar people. Jacob discovered he did not mind the interaction as much as he expected. The work had a purpose, a clear beginning and end, a tangible result that satisfied something deep in him. But it was the evenings he treasured most. After the forge was banked and the shop closed, they would return to the house where Margaret cooked meals that reminded Jacob of his childhood, of his mother's kitchen, and family gathered around a table. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and silence in equal measure. Margaret told him about the books she loved, the dreams she had harbored as a girl of seeing the wider world, the contentment she had found in building a life with Samuel, despite those dreams remaining unfulfilled. Jacob shared memories of his brothers, the pranks they played and the fights they had, the bittersweet ache of family ties he had severed to find his independence. "Do you regret leaving?" Margaret asked one evening, darning socks while Jacob repaired a broken knife handle. "Sometimes," Jacob admitted, "but I would have regretted staying more. There was not enough room for all of us, and I was not suited to being a younger son with no prospects. You could have stayed and fought for your place. I could have, but fighting your own family leaves scars that do not heal. Better to make my own way." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Samuel used to say that some people are born to put down roots, and others are born to wander. He said the trick was knowing which you were and not trying to be the other." "Which was he?" "Roots," Margaret said softly. "Deep ones. He loved this place, this shop, this life. He would have been miserable anywhere else." She paused. "I think I am the same way. I need a place that is mine, walls around me, stability. The world is too big and frightening without that." "And what am I?" Jacob asked, though he was not sure he wanted the answer. Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting his across the small room. "I think you are someone who thought he wanted to wander, but has been looking for roots the whole time. You just needed the right place to plant them." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Jacob felt his breath catch, felt the weight of all the things he wanted to say but could not, should not. Margaret held his gaze for a long moment, then returned to her darning, and the moment passed, but its residue remained, changing something fundamental in the air between them. November deepened into December. The snows grew heavier, the cold more intense. Jacob made one trip up to his cabin, checking that it had survived the early storms, bringing down more of his belongings. He told himself it was practical, that he would need more clothes and supplies for the winter. But he knew, and suspected Margaret knew, that he was slowly moving his life down from the mountain, slowly allowing himself to imagine a different future. Christmas approached, and the town prepared for the holiday with the enthusiasm of people who needed bright spots in the harsh winter. Margaret decorated the house with pine boughs and candles, and the familiar scents stirred memories in Jacob of Christmases past, of family and warmth and belonging. On Christmas Eve, Margaret prepared a feast, turkey and potatoes and pie made from preserved apples. They ate together in the glow of candlelight, and afterward Jacob presented her with a gift he had been working on in secret, a set of 3 iron hooks shaped like pine branches, decorative and functional, the metalwork as fine as he could manage. Margaret's eyes filled with tears when she saw them. "Jacob, they are beautiful. You made these? You said Samuel could make art, and you could only make useful things. I wanted to show you that useful things can be art too." She traced the curves of the metal with gentle fingers. "He would have liked these. He would have been proud of your work." "I hope so." Margaret disappeared into her room and returned with a wrapped parcel, pressing it into his hands. Inside was a shirt she had sewn, fine wool in deep blue, the stitching small and precise. "I noticed your shirts were getting worn," she said shyly. "I thought you could use a new one." Jacob held the shirt, overwhelmed by the intimacy of the gift, the care it represented. "Thank you. I will treasure it." They sat together by the fire after that, not talking, just existing in shared space. The silence was comfortable, peaceful, but underneath it, Jacob felt the current of everything unspoken, all the feelings building between them like steam in a sealed kettle. Finally, he could not contain it any more. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." She turned to him, firelight dancing across her face, her expression open and waiting. "I did not buy the forge just to help you," Jacob continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I mean, I did want to help, but that was not the only reason. The truth is, from the moment I saw you standing in that doorway, exhausted and brave and determined not to break, I felt something I have not felt in a very long time, maybe ever." Margaret's breath caught, her hands stilling on the mending in her lap. "I know it is too soon," Jacob said quickly. "You are still mourning Samuel, and I respect that. I am not asking for anything, not expecting anything. I just need you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. Working beside you, talking with you, sharing this space. It has shown me what I have been missing all these years alone on the mountain. It has shown me what I want for the rest of my life." "What do you want?" Margaret whispered. "You," Jacob said simply. "A life with you. A home with you. Partnership and companionship and everything that comes with it. But I will wait as long as you need. I will be your friend and business partner and nothing more until you are ready for something else, if you ever are. I just needed you to know." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, catching the firelight. "I thought I was being foolish," she said, her voice shaking. "I thought I was betraying Samuel's memory by feeling the things I have been feeling for you. I loved my husband, truly loved him, and losing him nearly destroyed me. I know. But these last months, working with you, being near you, I have felt myself coming back to life. You are so different from Samuel, all rough edges and strength where he was gentle and patient. But you have the same goodness in you, the same fundamental decency, and I have found myself thinking about you at night, wondering if what I feel is real or just gratitude or loneliness, or fear of being alone." "And what do you think now?" Jacob asked, barely breathing. Margaret set aside her mending and stood, crossing to where he sat. She reached out and touched his face, her palm soft against his bearded cheek. "I think I have been falling in love with you since the day you walked through my door and offered to buy a forge you had no use for just to keep me in my home. I think I've been fighting it because it felt too soon, too fast, too much like I was forgetting the man I buried. But Samuel would not want me to be alone for the rest of my life. He would want me to be happy. And you make me happy, Jacob Moss. You make me feel safe and valued and alive. Jacob stood, his hands coming up to gently hold her waist, feeling the soft curves of her body beneath the fabric of her dress. Are you sure? I am not an easy man. I am rough and solitary, and I do not know how to be the kind of husband who lives in town and goes to church socials. I do not need that kind of husband, Margaret said, smiling through her tears. I need someone strong and honest who will work beside me and build a life with me. I need someone who sees me as a partner, not just a wife to keep house and look pretty. Samuel gave me that, and I think you could too. I would try every day to give you that, Jacob promised. Then that's enough. He kissed her then, tentative at first, asking permission with every movement. But Margaret responded with a hunger that matched his own, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against him. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and longing pouring out between them, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathless and flushed. We should wait, Margaret said, though she made no move to step away. Do this properly. Court and marry and make it right. Yes, Jacob agreed, we should wait. But they stood there holding each other for a long time, neither willing to break the connection, both savoring the miracle of finding love when neither had been looking for it. The winter continued, but now everything was different. Jacob and Margaret courted with the intensity of people who had already wasted too much time, who knew how quickly life could change and wanted to seize happiness while it was offered. They were proper about it, maintaining separate rooms and observing the formalities, but everyone in Salvation Creek could see the change in them, the way they looked at each other, the quiet joy that radiated from both. Jacob proposed formally in January, presenting Margaret with a ring he had forged himself, twisting silver and gold together in a pattern that symbolized two lives intertwining. She said yes before he even finished asking, laughing and crying at the same time, and they set a date for early spring when the mountain passes would be clear enough for a proper celebration. The wedding took place in April of 1879, in the small church at the center of Salvation Creek. Margaret wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk, and Jacob wore the blue shirt she had made him, along with new trousers and a vest he had purchased specially for the occasion. Half the town attended, cramming into the small building to witness the union of the widow and the hermit, two people who had found each other against all odds. Jacob's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger, and his voice was thick with emotion when he made his vows. Margaret glowed with happiness, her curves soft and beautiful in the light streaming through the church windows, her eyes never leaving his face. When the preacher pronounced them married and Jacob kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward was boisterous and joyful, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Jacob, who had not danced in a decade, let Margaret teach him the steps, stumbling through them with good-natured clumsiness while she laughed at his efforts. It was perfect and ridiculous, and everything a wedding should be. When they finally returned home, alone for the first time as husband and wife, Jacob carried Margaret over the threshold of the house that was now fully theirs together. They moved to the bedroom they would now share, and there in the privacy of their own space, they came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies, celebrating the commitment they had made. Margaret was soft and warm in his arms, generous and responsive, meeting his hunger with her own. Jacob took his time, wanting to memorize every curve, every sound she made, every shiver of pleasure. When they finally joined completely, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, like finding the piece of himself he had not known was missing. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Margaret's head on his chest, his arms around her solid, comforting weight. "I never thought I would have this again," she whispered. "After Samuel died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would grow old alone and sad." "You saved me too," Jacob said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I did not even know I needed saving, but I was dying up on that mountain, freezing to death one piece at a time. You brought me back to life. Then we saved each other." "Yes, we did." They built their life together with the same care and precision that went into their forge work. Jacob continued to trap and hunt in the high country during the summer months, but he always came back to Salvation Creek, to Margaret, to the home and business they shared. Margaret ran the forge with growing confidence, taking on more complex commissions, building a reputation that brought customers from towns 50 miles away. In the summer of 1880, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. She was 30 now, and the pregnancy was hard on her body in ways her age and size made more challenging. Jacob hovered anxiously, trying to balance his need to protect her with her fierce independence and refusal to be treated like an invalid. "I am not fragile," she told him when he tried to stop her from working at the forge in her 6th month. "Women have been having babies and doing hard work since the beginning of time. I will not spend months sitting idle just because I am carrying a child." "I just want you safe," Jacob said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You and the baby both." Margaret's expression softened. She took his hand and placed it on her swollen belly, letting him feel the movement of the child within. "We are both strong. We will be fine. But I need you to trust me to know my own limits." Jacob learned to step back, to offer help without insisting on it, to support without smothering. It was not easy for a man used to solving problems through action, but he managed, driven by love and respect for his wife's strength. In February of 1881, on a night when the wind howled down from the mountains and snow piled against the windows, Margaret went into labor. The town's midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, arrived and took over the bedroom, banishing Jacob to the main room where he paced like a caged animal, listening to Margaret's labored breathing and occasional cries of pain. The labor lasted through the night and into the following day, each hour stretching into eternity for Jacob. He had faced bears and mountain lions without flinching, but the sounds of his wife in pain nearly unmade him. Finally, just as the sun was setting on the second day, he heard a different sound, a thin wail that made his heart stop and then race. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the bedroom, her expression tired but satisfied. "You have a son, Mr. Moss, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is exhausted but well." Jacob rushed past her into the bedroom, where Margaret lay pale and sweat-soaked against the pillows, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up at him with a smile that was equal parts exhausted and triumphant. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Jacob approached as if walking on sacred ground, his eyes fixed on the tiny red face barely visible within the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a squashed, furious expression, his fists waving as he wailed his displeasure at being expelled into the cold world. "He is perfect," Jacob breathed, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his calloused finger with surprising strength, and Jacob felt his throat close with emotion. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Samuel," Margaret said quietly, "for the man who brought me to this place and this life, but only if you are comfortable with that." Jacob thought about the husband Margaret had loved and lost, the man whose death had inadvertently led to this moment. It felt right to honor him, to acknowledge that their happiness was built on the foundation he had laid. "Samuel Jacob Moss," he said firmly, "for the past and the future both." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Perfect. The years that followed were full and rich. Samuel grew into a sturdy boy with his mother's kindness and his father's strength, equally comfortable at the forge or exploring the mountain trails. In 1883, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, red-haired and fierce from the moment she arrived. 2 years later came another son, Thomas, quiet and thoughtful, content to watch the world with serious eyes. The forge prospered. Jacob had become a skilled blacksmith in his own right, and together he and Margaret built a reputation for quality work and fair dealing. The business supported them comfortably, allowing them to expand the house, to put away money for their children's futures, to help their neighbors when times were hard. Jacob never completely gave up the high country. Every summer he would spend a few weeks in the mountains, teaching his sons to track and hunt, sharing with them the wild places that had once been his only home. But he always came back to Salvation Creek, to Margaret, to the life they had built together. The solitude that had once felt like freedom now felt empty without his family to return to. Margaret softened and rounded with the years and the children, her body bearing the marks of the life she had lived, and Jacob loved every curve, every change, seeing in them the evidence of their shared journey. She grew more confident in her skills, took pride in her work, became a pillar of the community in ways Samuel had never quite managed. On their 10th anniversary, Jacob presented her with a set of fireplace tools he had forged, each piece decorated with delicate scrollwork that had taken him months to perfect. Margaret cried when she saw them, recognizing the symbolism, the way he had transformed useful objects into art just as she had once said Samuel could do. "You have become everything I hoped and more," she told him, holding the tools like precious treasures. "When I married you, I thought I was getting a strong man who would protect and provide. I got that, but I also got a partner who sees me as an equal, who values my work and my mind, who has built this life with me rather than for me." "You made me into someone worth being," Jacob replied, pulling her close. "I was half a person before you, just existing rather than living. You showed me what it means to be part of something larger than myself, to have roots and purpose and love." They stood together in the home they had made, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, and Jacob felt a contentment so deep and complete that it brought tears to his eyes. He thought about the man he had been, alone on his mountain, convinced he needed nothing and no one. That man seemed like a stranger now, a ghost from another life. The children grew, the business thrived, and the years accumulated into a tapestry of ordinary miracles. There were hard times too, winters that were brutal, illnesses that frightened them, arguments that flared hot before cooling into reconciliation. But through it all, the foundation they had built held firm, their love deepening and maturing like good whiskey, aging in a barrel. In 1893, when Jacob was 44 and Margaret 41, they sat together on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset over the mountains. Samuel was 12 now, already showing signs of becoming a formidable blacksmith in his own right. Sarah at 10 was a force of nature, equally likely to be found climbing trees or helping her mother with intricate metalwork. Thomas at 8 was the family scholar, always reading, asking questions that sometimes stumped even his parents. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked, her head resting on Jacob's shoulder. "Giving up your solitary life for this chaos?" Jacob laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Not for a single moment. Well, maybe occasionally when Thomas asks me to explain something I do not understand, or when Sarah brings home another injured animal for us to nurse. But those are good problems to have." "We have been blessed," Margaret said softly, "more than I ever dreamed possible." "We made our own blessings," Jacob corrected. "We took broken pieces and forged them into something new and strong. That is not luck. That is work and love and commitment." The blacksmith philosophy applies to life as well as metal. Everything worth having is forged in fire. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered, the sounds of their children playing in the yard mingling with the familiar noises of the town settling in for the night. The forge behind the house was cold now, but come morning it would roar to life again, continuing the work that had brought them together and sustained them through the years. Jacob thought about that day 15 years ago when he had walked into Margaret's house with no clear plan, operating on instinct and a feeling he could not name. He had told himself it was about doing the right thing, about honoring a good man's memory and helping someone in need. And it had been those things, but it had also been the beginning of his real life, the moment when his story truly started. He tightened his arm around his wife, feeling the solid warmth of her against his side, and silently thanked whatever force had led him down from his mountain that September morning. He had thought he was buying tools and property, but what he had really purchased was a future, a family, a reason to live rather than just exist. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air, and Jacob Moss, former hermit and now devoted husband and father, felt the kind of peace that only comes from being exactly where you were supposed to be, with exactly who you were supposed to be with, doing exactly what you are meant to do. The story of how a lonely mountain man bought a blacksmith's tools to provide for a plump widow had become the story of how two broken people found healing in each other, how generosity born of loneliness became love, born of respect, and how the ringing of a hammer on an anvil could sound like a heartbeat, steady and strong and true. As 1894 dawned, Salvation Creek was blanketed in its heaviest snowfall in years. Jacob stood at the window of their bedroom in the early morning darkness, watching the flakes drift down like frozen stars. Margaret stirred behind him, and he felt her arms wrap around his waist, her warmth pressing against his back. "Cannot sleep?" she murmured, her voice thick with drowsiness. "Just thinking," Jacob replied, covering her hands with his own. "Remembering." "Remembering what?" "The first time I walked through your door. How terrified I was, how certain I was making a fool of myself. I had no plan, no real reason beyond this feeling in my gut that I could not let you lose your home." Margaret pressed her cheek against his shoulder blade. "I thought you were either crazy or an angel. I could not decide which." "Probably a bit of both," she laughed softly. "I was so lost back then. Samuel's death had broken something in me, and the prospect of losing everything we had built together was destroying what was left. Then you appeared like something out of a story, this huge, quiet man offering salvation for no reason I could understand." "I understand it now," Jacob said. "I was saving myself as much as you. I just did not know it at the time." They stood together in the darkness, listening to the house creak and settle around them, their children sleeping peacefully in their rooms. After a moment, Margaret tugged him back toward the bed, and they curled together under the quilts she had made, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long familiarity. "I love you," Margaret whispered into the darkness, "more than I have words to express." "I love you too," Jacob replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Every day for the rest of my life, I will love you." The years continued their steady march. Samuel, at 15, was already taller than his mother, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's quick mind. He had decided he wanted to expand the business, to add more sophisticated metalwork, decorative pieces, and custom tools that would bring in customers from even farther afield. Jacob and Margaret supported his ambitions, proud of his initiative and skill. Sarah, at 13, showed no interest in the domestic arts that other girls her age were learning. Instead, she spent her time at the forge or exploring the mountains, and when anyone suggested she should be more ladylike, she would fix them with a stare that could melt iron and inform them that she was exactly as ladylike as she chose to be. Margaret found it both exasperating and hilarious, seeing so much of herself in her daughter's fierce independence. Thomas, at 11, had discovered a love of drawing, sketching everything he saw with an attention to detail that sometimes bordered on obsessive. He drew the forge equipment, the mountain landscapes, the people of the town, creating a visual record of their lives that Jacob knew would be treasured for generations. In 1896, tragedy struck when a fire broke out in the town's main boarding house, the old wooden structure going up like kindling in the dry summer heat. The entire town turned out to fight the blaze, forming bucket brigades from the creek, while Jacob and several other men risked their lives to pull people from the burning building. By the time the fire was contained, 3 people had died, and a dozen more were homeless. The tragedy shook the community, and in its aftermath, Jacob and Margaret found themselves at the center of relief efforts. They opened their home to displaced families, fed and housed them while new accommodations were arranged. Jacob led the effort to rebuild, donating materials and labor, while Margaret organized the women to cook and care for the injured. Working together under such dire circumstances reminded them both of how fragile life was, how quickly everything could be lost. That night, after the refugees had been settled and their children put to bed, they made love with an urgency born of awareness of mortality, clinging to each other as if they could ward off death through the intensity of their connection. "Promise me," Margaret whispered afterward, tears tracking down her face, "that if something happens to me, you will not retreat back to your mountain. You will stay here with the children, be present in their lives." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Jacob said fiercely, wiping her tears with his thumb. "But if it does, promise me." "I promise. But you have to promise me the same. If I die first, you will not shut yourself away. You will keep living, keep working, keep being the strong woman I fell in love with. I promise." They held each other through the night, listening to each other breathe, grateful for every moment they had been given and would be given still. The turn of the century arrived with both excitement and anxiety. The world was changing rapidly. new technologies and ideas flooding into even remote places like Salvation Creek. There was talk of electricity, of automobiles, of flying machines. The old ways were fading, and while Jacob and Margaret adapted where necessary, they held firm to the values that had served them well. In 1902, Samuel married a girl from Denver, a smart and capable young woman named Elizabeth, who had visited Salvation Creek and fallen in love with both the place and the young blacksmith who worked there. The wedding was a grand affair, and Jacob stood beside his son with pride bursting through his chest, remembering his own wedding day and marveling at how quickly time had passed. Sarah, at 19, showed no interest in marriage, much to the frustration of the local young men who had been courting her with increasing desperation. She had other plans involving travel and adventure, and she informed her parents that she would marry when she was good and ready and not a moment before. Jacob secretly admired her independence, even as he worried about her safety in a world that was not always kind to unconventional women. Thomas, at 17, had been offered a scholarship to study art in Chicago, a tremendous opportunity that filled his parents with both pride and sadness. The thought of him so far away was painful, but they knew they could not hold him back from his dreams. He would leave in the fall, and the house would seem emptier without his quiet presence. In the summer of 1903, Jacob took Margaret back up to his old cabin for the first time since they had married. The structure had fallen into disrepair, the roof sagging, the windows broken. They stood together in the clearing, looking at the place where Jacob had spent 7 years of his life. "It is so small," Margaret said wonderingly. "How did you stand it, being alone in this tiny space for so long?" "I did not know any different," Jacob replied. "I thought I was content. I thought solitude was what I wanted." He turned to her, taking both her hands. "I was an idiot." Margaret laughed, the sound echoing across the high meadow. "Yes, you were, but you figured it out eventually. Thanks to you." They spent the afternoon there, walking the trails Jacob had once walked alone, and he showed her his favorite places, the spots where he had hunted and trapped and simply existed. But it all felt distant now, like memories from someone else's life. His real life had started the day he bought a forge. He did not need to help a woman he barely knew, and everything before that was just prologue. As they prepared to descend back to Salvation Creek, Margaret paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back at the ruined cabin. "Should we fix it up? Keep it as a retreat?" Jacob considered, then shook his head. "No, let it go. Let the forest take it back. That part of my life is over, and I do not need a monument to it. Everything I want is down in that valley." They rode back together as the sun set, and Jacob did not look back. The years between 1903 and 1910 were good ones, marked by steady work, family gatherings, and the quiet accumulation of memories that make up a well-lived life. Samuel and Elizabeth had 3 children, giving Jacob and Margaret grandchildren to spoil and delight in. Sarah eventually did marry, choosing a geologist who appreciated her adventurous spirit and supported her unconventional interests. They traveled extensively, sending letters from exotic locations that the family read aloud at dinner with fascination and envy. Thomas thrived in Chicago, his artistic talent blossoming under professional instruction. His paintings began to sell, and he achieved a modest fame in certain circles. But he came home every summer, drawn back to the mountains and the family that had nurtured his creativity. Jacob and Margaret grew older with grace, their hair graying, their bodies slowing, but their love as strong as ever. The forge work was mostly Samuel's now, though Jacob still took on projects when the spirit moved him, and Margaret supervised the business side with the same sharp mind she had always possessed. In 1912, on a warm June evening, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Jacob was 63 now, still strong but feeling the weight of his years. Margaret at 60 was softer and rounder than ever, her hair completely white, her face lined with the evidence of a life well lived. "We have done well, haven't we?" she said, reaching for his hand. Jacob laced his fingers through hers, marveling as he always did at how perfectly they fit together. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. Do you have any regrets?" "Only that we did not have more time. That I wasted 7 years alone when I could have been finding my way to you sooner." "Those 7 years made you who you were when we met," Margaret said wisely. "Without them, you might not have been ready to take a chance on a desperate widow with a mountain of debt." You are probably right. You usually are. She laughed, the sound still as bright and warm as it had been 34 years ago when he first made her smile. I love you, Jacob Moss. Thank you for buying a forge you did not need and changing my life. Thank you for teaching me how to live, Jacob replied, for showing me that being strong does not mean being alone, and that the best kind of strength comes from connection, not isolation. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, the sounds of their grandchildren playing in the yard, the lights of Salvation Creek twinkling in the gathering dusk. It was an ordinary evening, unremarkable in any objective sense, but to Jacob it was precious beyond measure, another moment in the vast collection of moments that made up their shared life. The seasons turned, as they always did. Winter came and went, then spring with its promise of renewal. In April of 1913, Jacob and Margaret celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary with their children and grandchildren gathered around them, a noisy, joyful celebration that lasted well into the night. When everyone had finally gone home and they were alone again, Margaret turned to Jacob with tears in her eyes. "This is everything I never knew I wanted," she said. "This family, this life, this love. Samuel gave me a good life, but you gave me a great one." Jacob pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her in his arms. "We gave each other a great life. That is what partnership means." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, their bodies knowing each other's rhythms and responses as intimately as their own. Afterward, tangled together in the darkness, Jacob felt a peace so complete it was almost frightening in its intensity. The years continued, bringing changes and challenges. The world erupted into war in 1914, and though it seemed distant from their mountain valley, it touched them nonetheless. Young men from Salvation Creek enlisted and went off to fight in foreign lands, and some did not return. Jacob and Margaret did what they could to support the families left behind, providing work and assistance, being the steady presence the community needed in uncertain times. In 1918, the influenza pandemic swept through, and Salvation Creek was not spared. Jacob and Margaret both fell ill, and for a terrifying week, their children feared they would lose both parents at once. But they were tough, forged in the hard life of the frontier, and they survived when younger, seemingly stronger people did not. The experience left them shaken but grateful, more aware than ever of how precious their time together was. They began to slow down, to let Samuel take over more of the forge work, to spend their days in quieter pursuits. Jacob took up whittling, creating small wooden animals for his grandchildren. Margaret returned to the extensive reading she had loved as a girl, working her way through every book she could get her hands on. But every evening, without fail, they sat together on their porch, holding hands, watching the sunset over the mountains that had witnessed their entire story. In the spring of 1925, Jacob woke one morning to find Margaret still asleep beside him, her breathing shallow and labored. He called for the doctor immediately, his heart hammering with fear. The doctor's diagnosis was grave. Her heart was failing, weakened by years of hard work and the lingering effects of the influenza. "How long?" Jacob asked, his voice barely functioning. "Weeks, maybe months if she is lucky and takes it easy." "I am sorry, Jacob. There is nothing more I can do." Jacob sat beside Margaret's bed, holding her hand, watching her sleep. When she woke, he told her gently, and she took the news with the same calm strength she had shown through every crisis. "I am not afraid," she said, her voice weak but steady. "I have had a wonderful life, more than I deserved, and I will have you with me until the end. That is more than most people get." "I cannot lose you," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "I do not know how to be in this world without you." "Yes, you do," Margaret said firmly. "You will stay here with our children and grandchildren. You will keep living and loving and being the good man you have always been. You will not retreat to some mountain and hide from life. Promise me." "I promise," Jacob choked out, remembering the promise they had made so many years ago. Margaret lived for 6 more weeks, long enough to see the spring flowers bloom, long enough to have each of her children and grandchildren visit and say goodbye. She died on a sunny May morning with Jacob holding her hand, her last words a whispered, "I love you," that he would carry with him for the rest of his days. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Colorado, people coming from miles around to pay their respects to the woman who had been the heart of Salvation Creek for decades. Jacob stood beside her grave, his children supporting him on either side, and felt a grief so profound it seemed impossible that the world could still be spinning, that the sun could still be shining, that life could somehow continue. But it did continue. The days passed, then weeks, then months. Jacob kept his promise, staying in Salvation Creek, being present for his family, showing up even when all he wanted to do was disappear. Samuel ran the forge now, doing excellent work, but Jacob still came by most days, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of hammer on metal, the heat of the fire, the smell of coal smoke. He talked to Margaret constantly, updating her on the family news, telling her about his day, seeking her advice on decisions both large and small. His children worried about him, but he assured them he was all right, that talking to her brought comfort rather than pain. On their wedding anniversary in April of 1926, Jacob took a ride up into the high country, returning to the meadow where his old cabin had once stood. Nothing remained of the structure now, the forest having reclaimed the clearing almost completely. He sat on a fallen log and spoke to Margaret as if she were sitting beside him. "I have been thinking about how it all started," he said to the empty air, "how I came down from this mountain and walked into your life on what I told myself was a whim but was really fate. How buying a forge I did not need turned into the best decision I ever made. How a lonely mountain man and a grieving widow built a life that exceeded anything either of us could have imagined." The wind rustled through the pine trees, and Jacob chose to interpret it as Margaret's response. "I miss you every moment," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I am not sorry for the grief because it is proof of how much I loved you, how much we had together. You gave me everything, Margaret. A home, a family, a purpose, a reason to be more than I was. I was half a person before you, and you made me whole." He sat there for a long time, remembering. The first time he saw her standing in her doorway, exhausted and determined, the way she smiled when she was truly happy, the feel of her hand in his, the sound of her laugh, the taste of her lips, the warmth of her body next to his in the darkness, all the million small moments that accumulated into a lifetime of love. Finally, as the sun began to set, Jacob stood and made his way back down the mountain. He had promised Margaret he would keep living, and so he would. Not because it was easy, but because she had asked it of him, and he had never been able to deny her anything. The years that followed were quieter, but not empty. Jacob became the patriarch of a large and loving family, his children and grandchildren gathering regularly, filling his house with noise and life. He watched his grandchildren grow, marry, have children of their own. He taught the great-grandchildren to whittle, to track, to appreciate the wild places that had shaped him. He told them stories about their great-grandmother, about the woman who had been brave and strong and kind, who had built a business and raised a family and changed the life of a stubborn mountain man who thought he needed no one. The children listened with wide eyes, and Jacob made sure that Margaret's memory would live on through the generations. In 1932, at the age of 83, Jacob Moss died peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Margaret for 34 years. His children found him in the morning, a slight smile on his weathered face, his hand resting on the pillow that had been hers, as if even in death he reached for her. They buried him beside Margaret in the Salvation Creek Cemetery, under the shade of a massive pine tree with a view of the mountains. The headstone read, "Jacob Moss, beloved husband, father, grandfather." He came down from the mountain and found his home. Beneath it, on Margaret's matching stone, Margaret Hartwell Moss, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She showed him what it means to live. The forge continued to operate for another 50 years, run by Samuel and then his children, the business Margaret and Jacob had built together, becoming a legacy that served the community for generations. The house they had shared remained in the family, carefully maintained, a repository of memories and love. And in the mountains above Salvation Creek, where Jacob had once lived alone and convinced himself he was content, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the echo of two lives that had intertwined against all odds, a lonely mountain man and a plump widow who had saved each other and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. Their story became legend in the valley, the tale of how an act of unexpected kindness had blossomed into a love that endured beyond death, proof that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance on someone when there is no logical reason to do so, only the feeling in your gut that says, "This is right. This is true. This is where your life really begins." The tools Jacob bought that September day in 1878 were still in use a century later, passed down through the family, cared for and maintained, each hammer and tong and anvil a testament to the transaction that changed everything. And though the people who wielded them might not have known the full story, they knew that their family had been built on a foundation of courage, generosity, and love, and that legacy lived on in every strike of hammer on metal, every useful thing created, every act of kindness shown to someone in need. It was a good life, the life Jacob and Margaret built together, a life forged in fire and tempered by time, strong and useful and beautiful, a life that proved that loneliness does not have to be permanent, that second chances exist, and that sometimes buying a forge you do not need to help a widow you barely know is not foolishness, but the smartest thing a man can do. It was a life well lived, and in the end, that is all anyone can ask for, to have loved and been loved, to have made a difference, to have left the world better than you found it, and to have found the place where you belong after years of searching. And in the quiet moments when the wind blew just right through the valley, the people of Salvation Creek swore they could hear the sound of a hammer ringing on an anvil, steady and strong and true, the heartbeat of a love that transcended time, the echo of two souls who had found each other when both needed it most, and built a legacy that would endure forever.